everyone, and welcome to the Gift of the Struggle podcast. We are here today with Cassidy Ford, who is a good friend of mine. And she is here because she's got a passion for raising awareness of something that she experiences day in and day out. Because this month is Tourette Awareness Month. I think it's from middle of May to middle of June, right, Cassidy?
Yeah, May 15th through June 15th.
Okay, so we wanted to have a conversation about that because with neurodiversity, there's so much unknown and so much people don't understand about how to navigate on both sides. So Cassidy, welcome, and tell us a little bit about you.
Thank you for having me. This is something that I shout from the rooftops. I really enjoy talking about this. It's something very close to my heart, obviously, because I have Tourette syndrome. And I also have 2 learning disabilities. And I have found, throughout my career, I'm in the franchise space and I have worked for franchisors throughout my career, worked on many sides of the industry. And I have had different experiences everywhere I've gone in work and the people that I've worked with and how accepting or how challenging it's been with those different people. So I have had Tourette's as a diagnosis since I was 25, but my tics started when I was 17. Nice. So I don't know if we want to take a step back. I can kind of explain what Tourette syndrome is. And maybe that'll help.
Start there with the baseline, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about exactly what it is and what it involves. So why don't you give us a rundown?
Yes. Okay. So Tourette syndrome is a neurological disorder. See, here I go. I'm talking and here I go. The tics are already coming. Tourette syndrome is a neurological condition where you have unwanted movements and vocal tics. So my body, I cannot control sometimes what I'm going to do. We have a sense of an urge that I can kind of feel coming on. So for me, I can sometimes control or suppress my tics. So a lot of people don't actually know that I have Tourette syndrome. In the media, it is depicted as something that is, it's a stigma, 100% a stigma, where you see the curse words and the violent movements and things like that. And that is a reality for many people who have Tourette syndrome. But for me, that is actually, it's called coprolalia or coprolalia, depending on what part of the country you're in. And that's the cursing tic. 1 in 10 people who have Tourette syndrome will have that cursing tic, and I happen to be one of them. So there are a lot of different statistics to go along with it, but it's interesting because during Tourette Awareness Month, I've been posting a lot of things about facts and kind of interesting things about Tourette's that you wouldn't necessarily know. And one thing that I found, they just did a 2022, the Tourette Association of America did an impact survey, and they talked to parents of kids who have Tourette's and then adults, about a 50-50 split that have Tourette syndrome. And the results, I did not know that about 50% of people who have Tourette's or a tic disorder go undiagnosed because a lot of doctors are uneducated about it. It's something that in the past has been ignored or pushed aside or brushed off as something else. And it's just in the last probably 10 or 15 years that there's been a lot of effort to educate caregivers and medical professionals about the condition. And it's been a part of my story that, and maybe we can kind of touch on that as we go along. But as an adult with Tourette's, it's definitely been part of my journey that people don't really know about it, and they don't know how to treat it.
In terms of medical professionals?
Yeah, so it's one of those things. Most people that have Tourette syndrome are diagnosed as children, and that has started to change a little bit over time because we're starting to recognize what the symptoms and signs are of the condition, and start to recognize that more and more in adults. And there's a lot of facts that I could go into about Tourette's, about a lot of people outgrow their tics through childhood into adulthood. I am not one of those. And I actually wasn't, my tics didn't even start till I was 17. It was a very scary experience because they at first did not. I went to Barrow Neurological in Phoenix, Arizona, which is, the Muhammad Ali Parkinson's Research Center. They know these things, and they didn't recognize the Tourette's or diagnose it. And it took a very long time and a lot of lonely days and nights of self-harming tics and screaming and shouting and punching myself in the face and jerking my head and arms and legs, and not really having anyone who was willing to say the word Tourette's. A lot of people, because of the stigma that's attached to it, even my own parents, they didn't want to say Tourette syndrome because there are there's a lot of consequences that go along with that when you finally sit down and say, hey, this is what it is. But it's definitely something that, as we've continued to put effort into research of it, and honestly, just empathy and the dialogue that's been opened up about mental health, about conditions like this, about disability rights, things like that, the conversation has just changed drastically.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting too, so when my youngest son was 2, he was diagnosed with epilepsy. And what I learned through that process was how little we know about the brain.
Yes.
They don't know a whole lot, because they said they could decide what part of the brain his seizures were coming from based on EEGs and the expression of them, the seizures. But they basically were like, we don't know how to fix it. We just know how to treat the symptoms. That's basically it.
Right.
And to me, even 17 years ago, that was shocking that's this neurologist who's so specialized is telling me we don't know much. We know what drugs work, and from the time he was diagnosed at 2, there were very few drugs, and by the time he outgrew his, there were a lot more drugs, so there was research being done. But have you found that to be the same? It sounds like you've had a similar experience, and what people don't know more than what they do know.
Absolutely. I think, back in the day, when 20, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, it started out where it was diagnosed as something that was more like a mental health condition. There was a lot of confusion about, is this psychological? Is this something that is neurological? Because the brain is so complex. And one of the things about Tourette syndrome is that there are things called co-occurring conditions that come along with it. And there's a statistic, this impact survey, I'm looking at it now because there's some really amazing information that's really jarring about what they found out from the survey. And just to name a few, 87% experience physical pain because of their tics.
Wow. And you've had that too. I mean, you've talked about neck pain and.
Absolutely. Yeah. The one that is really jarring is 42% reported one of the biggest challenges is dealing with the co-occurring disorders and symptoms more than the tics themselves. Wow. So for me, I have ADHD, which I was diagnosed when I was 5. So they recognized that early on. I dealt with that and then didn't know I had something called dyscalculia, which is, it has to do with numbers and things like that. And I really struggle with spreadsheets and numbers and things like that. I also have bipolar disorder. And that is, that's something that at one point was a lot harder for me to deal with than the tics. And even when
that's the comorbidity with is that commonly occurring with Tourette?
Yes, depression, anxiety, sleep disorders, behavioral issues, things like that. And what's so interesting and so difficult about Tourette's and a lot of other disabilities is that you have to parse through all of these other things in order to really get to the issue. And a lot of doctors maybe aren't willing to put in the effort to do that. They don't have the skill level to do that. And for instance, in the Southeast where I'm in Atlanta, there's one doctor in the Southeast who treats adults with Tourette syndrome. And it's really difficult to find someone who is going to have that skill level and the level of empathy that it takes to work with someone with a disability that has all of these other kind of satellite things that you're dealing with. Mm-hmm. And that's where it really becomes complex for people like me to have the support that I really need.
So statistically, how many people have Tourette syndrome?
Okay, I'm trying to remember. I think it's something like one in, I'm gonna quote it wrong. It's more than you think. It's a lot more than you think. It's much more common. I think the statistic, and I think it's 1 in 100 children is going to have some sort of tic disorder.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting, because that is way more than you would think.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had a friend who had a child born with a cleft palate,
mm-hmm.
and they would drive to New Orleans, and within the same medical facility, she would go see somebody about her dental, somebody about her speech, somebody about the physicality of getting it repaired. There's a plastic surgeon, all under one roof for that specific thing. And that's why they would drive to New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
We were in Pensacola. There is nothing like it sounds like, because with this, I would imagine you have the Tourette diagnosis, but all of the other things may not be dealt with by the same kind of provider, right?
Right. That's a huge part of my story. So when I was 25, I graduated college in the middle of a recession, no jobs. I was working 5 jobs just to make ends meet in Austin, Texas, where the cost of living was so high. So I was doing that, and I ended up getting a really great position at a law firm that I loved what I was doing. I worked there for 2 years, but it ended up becoming a stressful thing for me. My body started shutting down and going haywire. And I couldn't really figure out what was going on. None of my doctors in Austin could figure it out. And so they sent me to Mayo Clinic in Scottsdale, Arizona. And that was such a blessing to me. And not very many people are going to have the insurance coverage that is required to be able to afford that kind of thing, to travel there, the accommodations. It's very, very expensive to do that. I was very blessed to have all of those doctors, the holistic perspective to treat every aspect of my health under one roof. Mm-hmm. And I was there for a month, and that's where I was really fully able to understand what was going on with my body, what was going on in my brain. And a month after that, I went to Houston, and I was formally diagnosed with Tourette syndrome. So the results of that were, and this is where I have learned a lot of lessons. The results of me going to Mayo Clinic, they said, basically, you're too stressed. Your body doesn't handle stress well. You either quit your job or you completely fall apart. Like your body is just going to completely shut down. Yeah. And so I've had to set a lot of boundaries that a lot of my employers and a lot of my team members have not understood until I got to the point where I felt comfortable enough to really open up about, it's a given. It's when I meet people, I just say, hey, this is what I'm dealing with. This is who I am. This is part of how I work and operate and communicate. And if that's going to be a problem, then, I'm just going to have to find somewhere else to fit in to things. But I was so blessed. It's very difficult to find something like that. And that, I don't know that that's very common at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think it is, just from my limited experience with the epilepsy, which was, the good news was they knew that was neurological. They just didn't know
right.
what to do about it.
Right.
But there was no question about where it was coming from. So having that baseline did that give you the confidence to have more ability to self-advocate as you went through, and now you're living other places and having other jobs, having that knowledge base that they were able to give you, that you knew exactly what you were dealing with? Do you think that was something that was helpful to you in functioning in your life?
Yes. So one of the things that I will also shout from the rooftops and be a huge advocate for is for we as human beings, and especially as women, I feel like, to be advocates for our own health, to ask our doctors questions, to not be afraid that we're going to get shut down by the doctor and be dismissed and things like that. Because once I went through the process of dealing with probably, I don't know how many doctors I've seen in my lifetime. It's a lot. And I think I've learned this from my parents, which is a really valuable lesson of I'm in charge of my own health and my body and how I feel and my future. And so I have to really take charge of that and be intentional about it. And so going through that process and experiencing that with the doctors gave me a lot more confidence to be an advocate for myself in a lot of other areas, because I found that it was so important and vital. And like, it was something that I couldn't have done without, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Moving into other areas, I definitely, once I had a label for it, it was easier for me to start talking to the people around me and saying, hey, this is what this is. I think for 8 years, I knew what it was, but no one wanted to call it that, right? And it changed my life. It really changed my life. And now I encourage people, whatever you're dealing with, to be open about it. I think I've told this story before. A lot of people have heard this story, but I would always say to kind of stand up, speak up, show up, right? That's kind of like a motto that I have, because when you are kind of walking through a challenge, whatever it is, a disability specifically in my case, then no one's going to know what you're going through. Sometimes mental health for sure. No one knows what's going on behind the curtain. Yeah. No one knows, unless you say something, you have to be open. Because of my experiences, have been a lot more transparent with my teams. And there came a point in my company where I am now that I was really, really struggling. I was going through a period of depression and anxiety, and it was kind of impacting my work. And I was working really hard, and you couldn't really tell, but I knew and I felt it. And so I finally, once I just said, hey, I have bipolar and I have this learning disability. It's making it really hard for me to work under these certain circumstances. My team immediately changed their operating procedures, but changed the way that they operated to accommodate me. And like that, my life was better. Mm-hmm. And so you have to just kind of think through what could happen if I was more open and confident and embracing the things that I am finding as a challenge and finding joy in that, instead of just kind of keeping it all inside. And that can be tough.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of people feel like they are not safe to do that in the workplace, don't you?
Oh, for sure. I have 3 stories about that. So I'll narrow it down to one, is that there was a woman that I worked for, and there was a day that I was really overwhelmed because I was looking at these spreadsheets, and I had not told her or anyone at this point about having dyscalculia. And I was looking at these spreadsheets, and I was completely just, I couldn't figure it out. I can read a P&L, but it takes me a lot longer, right? Those types of things. And she was just rushing. And finally I said, okay, I can't do this. And this is the reason why. And she told me, you will never move up. You will never be a C-suite executive. You will never be able to do this, this, and this if you cannot read a spreadsheet. And it was one of those moments where I could have stepped back and said, this is the reason why I shouldn't share what's going on with me, because that's the reaction I'm going to get. But then I was like, that's bullshit. Like, people like that, you can't let other people dictate what you can and can't do, or what you should and shouldn't do. I don't believe in shoulds and shouldn'ts. I think that we just have to be brave enough to have those conversations, regardless of the reactions that we get. And if we get poor reactions from opening up about something that honestly, legally, you're allowed to request accommodations for, and we get poor reactions, that's not the place we need to be.
Yeah.
I feel very strongly.
Such important thing, especially for younger women and younger people, to learn that lesson. It's a hard lesson to learn. I did not learn to ask questions until I had kids. And And actually the epilepsy experience really empowered me to say, I need answers and I need to know what's going on. And, it's sometimes easier to do things for others than yourself. But I think when you have something going on like that, it's critically important. And, when I'll never forget one time in college, I had to apply to get into the creative writing program. So I sent the exact same packet to two different professors. And one professor was like, oh, you're really sentimental. You're sucky. You need to find a new career. And the other one was like, this is the greatest thing I've ever read. You're great. You're in. And I was like,
Yes.
but I didn't take it as personally because creative writing is subjective, right? So who cares? But I think I would imagine when you have a disability, you might really think, oh, well, maybe I can't do that, or maybe I won't do that if you don't have the self-assuredness to push back on that thought. Like for me with two, and luckily I got them at almost the exact same time. So I was like, well, clearly we have a difference of opinion here.
Right.
But I think as you are young and you're coming up, you struggle with issues of confidence, and you're new in a career and you don't know, maybe I'm not right for this, or maybe I'm not right for that. Or so to understand who you are, I think that's one of the things that attracts me to you, is that you have a very clear understanding of who you are, and you have a very clear understanding of what you're entitled to as a human. And I think knowing those things is what empowers you. And you're right. In any situation in life, you should not be in a position where somebody has that attitude toward you, disability or no disability, right?
Yeah. No one has a right to determine your self-worth except for you, right? Yeah. All of us have inherent value, and we just have to own it. And you can't let other people tear you down like that. I have a lot of just natural confidence and joy and peace about who I am as a person. I'll look in the mirror in the morning and I'll just be like, oh, you look good. Those are things that I come to me naturally, but I also am one of those people that is a people pleaser. And if someone says something to me that is what I perceive as negative about myself or my work at the beginning of the day, I have a tendency to let that ruin the rest of my day. I've had to work very, very hard as an adult to combat that. And I've gotten a lot better about it. But one of the things that I will say is surrounding yourself with the right people, with people who will build you up, with encouragers, with people who you can call on when you have those moments that you're about to spiral out for the rest of the day and let it ruin your day. That has been what has been a saving grace for me. And, you talked about being, having some courage. There are some examples of people. I have not been able to say I have a disability until probably the last 18 months, because there's been a little bit of not shame about that, but a little bit of guilt, I think, because there's so many people who have these really hard physical disabilities. And who am I to say no one can see that I struggle with this for the most part, except if I'm walking in Target and punch myself in the face, someone definitely would notice. But there are some really amazing people on Instagram, and maybe I should send you some of the accounts that your listeners can follow, some disability advocates that have really shown a lot of courage to me and been encouraging, and have shown me over the last year and a half or two what it means to have a disability and to choose joy and to really walk a tough road and kill it. They're rock stars.
I think that's one reason I think your openness is so important, because it does empower other people to feel accepted and acceptable and not abnormal. Like, I think everybody, somebody was, where was I reading it? That people would, we did an interview with somebody from LA Mental Health recently on a Pillars of Franchising podcast. And she said people would rather have a sense of belonging than live. Like, that's more important than survival almost, in terms of making choices. And so I think when you feel a sense of belonging, regardless of what you're doing, and I understand why you had a hard time with that, but I also, when I've experienced painful times in my life, like divorce or whatever, I used to downplay it too because I was okay. But somebody said one time, pain is pain. It's not a competition, just because your pain might be different from somebody else's or perceived as worse. And capacity is different. We all have a different capacity to endure. And so I think recognizing those two things is critically important to finding empathy. Just because you handle it well and you're advocate and you're open doesn't mean you're not exhausted from struggling every day or on different days when things are harder. It doesn't mean your disability is more or less than anybody else's. It is, it
Mm-hmm.
exists. And I think for all of us to recognize that, like, it isn't a competition. And, somebody might not be able to walk and struggles with that. That doesn't make your struggle any less or less worthy of empathy, right? So I think that understanding that's what I love about talking to people, is that the human side of things is so important. We all have struggle, we all have something, we all have pain. And if we're not looking to compare it with somebody else, then we can find that empathy that everybody needs. So I want you to talk to us about living with it, because when I first met you, it was on a happy hour thing that we did every week, and you were very, very open, and you were very willing to educate. And in some ways, I would imagine that's a burden, because why should you have to go around telling everybody, and educating them? But on the other hand, I think that could be a gift, because you're so willing to do it that you're going to help the people know how to communicate effectively with you and other people they might come in contact with. So talk to us a little bit about the importance of that, because I think that's one reason you've been so successful in your career.
I quote unquote came out about my Tourette's in 2018 on a LinkedIn article that I wrote. Back, I think 5 years ago, the types of things that we shared on LinkedIn versus the types of things that are shared now are drastically different. But there's been a transition over time that has happened. When I first started talking about my Tourette's and telling my professional network about it, I got mostly really amazing reactions to that. But then I also got messages from people that said, you shouldn't share this. This is too personal. A lot of people, they're putting that into a category of oversharing. And I had to combat that. And I just was like, screw them. Like, this is something that's super important. I know other people need to hear my story, because I felt very, very alone for 8 years in dealing with this by myself and not having a community. I joined a Tourette support group in Austin as soon as I was diagnosed. And that was also kind of life-changing for me. There's a Tourette support group here in Atlanta that I'm involved with, and really have had a great network of people. And I never would have had that if I hadn't been open about what I was going through. So it's really one of those things that you talk about having an invisible disability or something like that. What people don't realize, for me, for example, I'll use myself, is that I am a joyful person, and I try to portray that in everything that I do. But I also, it's tough, because at the same time that I am trying to be a positive person, I also have this inner dialogue in my brain, and my body is constantly telling me to move or to jerk, or I have a stream of curse words going in my head. I'm physically trying to, turn a punch into a wrist flick, or not flick someone off with my middle finger, like things like that. And it's exhausting by the end of the day. So that's one of the reasons why I have to set boundaries. I have to know my limits. I have to have the right people around me to shore that up. And, I know that there are other people that may not even have Tourette's, but they have some other disability. They have some challenge that they're going through. They may be experiencing a season of depression, whatever that is. The idea behind it is just being intentionally joyful, choosing joy, being perseverant. And that takes work, but it's a lot less work when you have I'm looking for a word. I'm looking for a word other than support. It's a community. It is the idea of accountability. Help me out here. I'm looking for a word.
I kind of like the word embraced. Is it people who embrace you in all of yourself?
Exactly. You're not hiding. It takes more effort to hide than to be open.
Yeah.
It takes far more effort. It's the same thing. How many muscles does it take to smile versus frown?
Right.
Right. It's a lot more work to frown. So why do it?
You've had days with me or within groups that we both belong to where you said, I'm really, really tired or I'm struggling today, and your tics are a little bit worse, but nobody in the group even notices anymore or cares. And so it can be more of that relaxed Cassidy at the end of the day who's tired and maybe a little more ticky. And that's because you have these people who embrace you, period.
Yes.
You know, I always say, you know, with my LGBT stuff work, it's I love you, period.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that applies to so many parts of your life, right?
Yes. And the more that you
but or if or when.
Yes. The more that you educate other people, and I heard someone talking about this the other day, and I forget who it was. They were giving a commencement speech at maybe like NYU or something. It was a person who had significant disabilities, and she was being honored with like an honorary degree. And in her speech, she was talking about how long COVID, now people who are experiencing the long-term effects and disabilities that long COVID has brought to the table, and especially with quarantine, mental health, all of those conversations have really opened up in the last 2 years. Mm-hmm. And it's been fun for me to watch. I know that's a terrible thing to say, but it's been a really helpful thing, I think, for society, in that we're having more open conversations, and the ability for me to share even more and educate other people. There's a burden that lifts off of me. I don't feel like it's a burden for me to do that. I feel it's a celebration. I do feel like it every time I have the chance to talk to a guy on a first date and say, hey, I have Tourette's and here's what Tourette's is. Mm-hmm. Like, if every time I'm in a grocery store and a kid comes up to me and asks, why are you whistling? Mm-hmm. Or why are you snapping your fingers? I can explain it. And that is a celebration, I think, of something that can be something really challenging.
Yeah, well, it destigmatizes it. And Absolutely. The fact that you're not afraid to talk about it makes other people unafraid to talk about it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's equally as important, because when you can put other people at ease and give them the option to ask questions or to understand, then you're gonna build that relationship so much more quickly. And that's mm-hmm. where you can make impact, you know, outside of your circle, really.
Think about the fact that if I am in a grocery store and a child comes up to me and asks, why are you doing that? And I take the time to sit and explain it, so the next time that they see someone with a disability, they'll know how to approach it better. They'll ask better questions. They'll be more empathetic. And that's a trickle effect out into society. And that's kind of how I view it. It's not just that interpersonal relationship. It is that. But there's also kind of a broader community effect. When we are open about things, it spreads like wildfire, and we just make ourselves better as human beings.
Yeah, and I think you've done that in the franchising community. I mean, I think everybody has embraced it beyond the initial coming out period when that's too much. But I think it's become a part of your platform and a part of, you know, your personal brand, if you want to call it that. But I think that makes people more open mm-hmm. to hiring people who might be neurodivergent, asking them what they need in order to work productively. And I think it shifts the traditional workforce in terms of what is expected. If you have some boundaries, if you have limitations, if you can't be on Zoom all the time, mm-hmm. because that's just too exhausting to try and control everything. If you are exhausted and you need to come to work a little bit later, or however it is that you work. And I think COVID has probably improved some of that too, because we've all become much more flexible in what the expectation of how we work is. Mm-hmm. So that's probably good for people, not only with disabilities, but people just trying to get through everyday life with families and work and kids and schools and whatever, and allowing people to be productive in the ways that's going to fit best in your life. Don't you think?
Yes. that impact survey that I'll keep going back to, right? I think it was so important because it was so shocking, the results. 37% of adults with Tourette's said that they had missed work because of their tics. And there, I think, was 59% of people who had Tourette's as adults who said that they felt like they had been prevented from fulfilling their full potential or living life to the fullest because of Tourette syndrome. And I think that kind of extends. I wouldn't know what the statistics are for, autism or, any other kind of neurodiverse group of people. But those things we need to understand that when we accommodate people, we bring out the best in them. We allow them to be their best selves. We allow them to fulfill their full potential. Mm-hmm. And those people could be incredible for your company. You see them in one context not doing well because they don't have the tools and resources and people in their lives that would help them, I hate the word blossom, help them become a really, really great asset. And there's a company in Texas that when I first got out of college really helped me a lot. It's called Peak Performers. And they work with neurodivergent and disabled folks to help place them in jobs. And I went through a process with them, and I recently reconnected with someone at Peak Performers and just had some really great conversations about this. And I did not know, but there are companies all over the country, including Peak Performers, who work specifically with neurodiverse and disabled people to place them in jobs with teams and leaders who are looking for those types of people because they know that they're incredible workers. Mm-hmm. And if we could just kind of spread the knowledge of that around, I think that we're missing out on a huge opportunity.
Yeah. Well, and so many people who struggle with either mental illness or, neurodiversity in any kind of way are stereotyped or stigmatized by that when they're just as smart, just as capable, just as hardworking, just as everything as any other person.
Or more.
And they just have this other facet of their personalities or their lives that they have to work a little harder or make accommodations or work a little differently. And I really enjoy watching you tell everybody all of these things, because I think if you look around, you are missing out on a huge pool of opportunity to give people the chance to perform at their best. It just may not look like the best way you perform. And you know what? We don't all perform well, regardless of who we are, in the same exact rigid standard. Nobody does.
One of the cool things I think about having a disability or a challenge or, whatever, you could take that and turn it around. Mm-hmm. And you're also learning something constantly that other people don't have the chance to learn. I already had a great sense of humor, but I've also had to learn a different kind of humor and looseness and kind of a casual way of dealing with people to let them feel more at ease.
Yeah.
And that has aided me, Tourette's is an icebreaker for me in an intro meeting for, a possible candidate, because, I'm in sales, right? Being able to form personal relationships, I have much more, it's a lot easier for me to do that because of what I have learned having Tourette syndrome. And, learning how to set boundaries, not just in work, but in life, with relationships, with my time, that are healthy. I probably wouldn't have learned that at such a young age without having Tourette syndrome. Things like that, it's a blessing.
Mm-hmm. So that brings me actually to our wrap-up question, which is, what are the gifts?
What are the gifts? So I definitely think, I talked about the sense of humor and all that kind of stuff. One of the things that a pastor of mine used to say when I was in high school was that God does not call the equipped, he equips the called. And I fully believe that I have been equipped with patience and empathy and a love for other people and their stories, and every tool that I've needed to get to where I am today and to someday stand on a stage and tell my story, write a book, travel, all of those things that I want to do, I've been given because of Tourette syndrome. And I wouldn't trade it for the world. I wouldn't trade it. As challenging as it is, it's the life that I love. Yeah.
That's why we love you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Cassidy, for coming on and giving us a good, healthy dose of what it's like to thrive with Tourette syndrome.
Well, I have been wanting to sit and have a conversation with you like this for a long time. So I'm glad that we got to do it.
I am too. All right, everybody take a look for social media posts coming up that talk about the impact survey. We can post that. We can provide some account links to support groups and education that people can take a look at to learn a little bit more. And Cassidy, I'm sure we'll talk to you again.
Yes.
All right, see ya.
Bye.